already been a long day. So anyhow, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and those who are still joining us will just continue to join us, so no problems there. So thank you, everybody. My name is Jenna Nilo. I am the Director of Marketing and Outreach for Illinois Digital Educators Alliance. Thank you all for joining us today, especially Allison. Thank you for joining us and taking us through the legislative update on remote learning and advocacy. This is obviously a super, super hot topic right now, and everybody's interested in it, so we're anxious to hear what you have to say, Allison. So in a minute, I'm going to turn things over to Allison, but I will try, Bonnie. Send out a Wi-Fi of my perfume. But anyhow, in a minute, I'm going to turn things over to Allison with Illinois Principals Association, IPA. And but before I do so, just a few housekeeping items. If you could do me a favor, keep your video off so that we don't see anything, whatever. But just it will give Allison the spotlight. So go ahead and turn your video off, and then also keep yourself muted. That way, when your dog starts barking in the background, like mine inevitably will, as she's laying by the front door just waiting for that to happen. So just keep yourself muted. That way, Allison will have the spotlight and won't get interrupted by our background noises. We do, however, encourage interaction throughout the presentation. So if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and use that chat feature. It's that little bubble, speech bubble on the bottom of your screen. You can pop that open and put in any questions, put the questions to everybody. I will be monitoring that chat for Allison as she's doing her presentation and interrupting when she takes a breath, when she changes topic, whenever it's appropriate. I will go ahead and interrupt Allison and get those questions answered. And then I'm pretty sure at the end, we're gonna have time for more Q&A if need be. So definitely use that. And then if you are looking for your PDHs, we do offer an hour PDH for Illinois educators at the end of this session. Then go ahead and pay attention to that chat window at the end of today's session, and I will be posting the link for the PDHs in there. We do require, ISB does require live attendance for those PDHs, so I will post that at the end of today's session. And I'll mention when I'm doing that. So I think that's it. Without further ado, Allison, welcome. I'm going to turn things over to you. I'm going to mute myself and turn myself off and give you the stage. So thanks so much, Allison.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me. So thanks, everyone. So my name is Allison Meili. I am the Government and Public Relations Director for the Illinois Principals Association. I've been there about 9 years now. Prior to that, just a little bit about me. So I am a native of Alton, Illinois. I'm an Alton Redbird, and I went to Eastern Illinois University for my undergrad. My intent was to be an engineering student and transfer to U of I, and it just didn't work out. So I pursued political science instead, and finished up at EIU. I was student body president and involved in all kinds of activities when I was there. After that, I took a job with the Illinois House of Representatives, and I worked for 2 different state reps in their district offices. So I spent some time in Harrisburg, Illinois, down south, and in Decatur, Illinois as well. And after that, I went back to Eastern and worked in fundraising for the university for a few years. And when I kind of was a little bit over being the older former student in my college town, I was looking for some new opportunities, and my now husband and I were dating, and he lived in Springfield. So the IPA job became available, and I pursued that. So it's been really a great opportunity to be here and to be at IPA and learn from you all and learn from our administrators. My mom was a special education teacher in Alton and East Alton Wood River and the Catholic Children's Home in Alton for a while. So I knew just enough about education, but certainly not everything I've learned so far. So thank you for having me, and hopefully this is beneficial to all of you. I will say I am a bit intimidating knowing that you are all tech educators and perhaps more digitally or presentationally more gifted than I am. So hopefully you don't judge me by my plainness of my slides today. So we'll just kind of get started here. So as you know, we had a really truncated legislative session this year. You know, generally their legislators are in Springfield from mid-January till the end of May, with May 31st being really the deadline to really get things done before you need a supermajority vote on things. But with everything else happening in the world and coronavirus, obviously we really didn't see legislators from about March 6th or so until the middle of May, middle to end of May. So they were here in Springfield from May 20th to the 23rd, just a 4-day session. As you can see in the photo here, a bit strange. So if any of you have ever been to the BOS Center in Springfield for an IPA event, for our conference, or any other events or conferences, this is the main exhibit hall. What we use is our exhibit hall. So the House of Representatives, of course, met at the BOS Center so that they could spread out with 118 members and staff and others that needed to be in the building. It was just too close quarters to be at the Capitol. So the House met at the BOS Center. The Senate still continued to meet in their chambers at the Capitol. But really, there was a big restriction on who could be in either building. So members of the public, lobbyists could be in the buildings, but you really couldn't do anything. There's no way to interact with members when they were on the floor. And really, from what I understand, contact was limited outside of the lobby area as well. So most lobbyists that I know, including myself, we stayed home because you can watch everything online. You know, we've got cell phones and email and everything else. So it was really just more efficient to really just be at home and be watching online. So with that being said, so they did a lot though in those 4 days, which kind of begs the question, why are we here for 4 or 5 months sometimes? But the biggest thing probably for everyone here is the Education Omnibus bill. And last I checked a couple of hours ago, it has still not been signed. It has been sent to the governor's office, but has not been signed yet. But that includes the remote learning plans, what those include, some flexibility due to the school closures, and it really kind of codified a lot of the executive orders that the governor has put in place since March, related to you know, graduation requirements, licensure extensions, student teachers being able to finish out their requirements, those types of things. Talk a little bit about the state budget. There was legislation to do a little bit more study in terms of broadband access for all residents in Illinois. And we'll close with, you know, advocating for schools, which from what I understand is what everyone may be interested in, or maybe needs some help with, or whatever I can do to help kind of guide you all into what the legislative process is like and how you can have an impact on that. So, and I see a hello. So Senate Bill 1569 is the Education Omnibus bill. And again, it has been sent to the governor. As far as I can understand, has not been signed yet as of this morning. But that includes remote learning planning days, the length of the school day, remote learning and blended learning plans, high school graduation requirements, licensure renewal extensions, and teacher evaluations. A few more sort of more minor items that were in there. There was some legislation or some language that was worked out between IAASE and school social workers related to IEPs and RTI and all the other letters of the alphabet, as well as some a bit of expansion on background checks for educators as well. But this is kind of really the meat and potatoes of the entire bill. So remote learning days, and hopefully I'm not, you know, really over explaining things that you've already heard or have already known about, but just kind of wanted to kind of give an overview and reminder of what all is in that legislation. So if there are more in-depth questions, just feel free to ask those in the chat or at the end if you feel like. So it really sets out that it allows remote and blended learning planning days to be used consecutively or sporadically to develop, review, or amend remote blended learning day plans, or provide professional development to staff regarding remote education. And just one more thing too, I wanted to add to that if a district already had an e-learning plan that they were using for snow days or what have you, that would satisfy a district's ability to have a remote learning plan. That the same thing would be fine for them to use, and hopefully, or perhaps you've all kind of experienced that in the last few months or so. It also made some changes to the length of the school day. So not necessarily changes, but just related to if you're using remote learning days or blended remote learning days, up to 5 of those, and planning days also could be deemed pupil attendance days. So there's a bit of a flexibility there for the school calendar and the length of the school day, since we're somewhat back on clock hours. So remote learning, I'm sure this is old news perhaps, but I think on my left here, you've got Instagram versus reality. So Instagram is like, oh, everyone's just sitting at the table and doing their work, and everyone has their own device, and everything's doing just fine. And hopefully this works. I tried it out earlier, but I like these 2 ladies that do some videos here and there. If I can get it to play.
When ours is out, we got to go to him.
Mathletics, Grammaropolis, ABC.
Eleanor, if you want to get on your Zoom, your name is Viper. Mondays, it's at 8:11. On Tuesdays, it's at 4:13. And Saturdays, it's at 1 a.m. Okay, another Zoom. I hope that Jeffrey kid doesn't talk about his sister's foot again.
We're not muted. Did you just toot?
No.
Oh my God!
I appreciate everyone jumping on today and doing the call.
What?
And so,
Oh my gosh, I just
what was
blew
the
up my
client's
face.
response?
Mama,
Were they pleased or?
yes.
Julia is planting vegetables in a rectangular garden. Use the distributive property to decompose the factor 12 into a sum.
PE time. Go, run. Put the iPad down.
Email address for you, Finn, with the 17826@14.com/school. Eleanor, same as you, 17825/ampersand941.com/school. Got it? Okay, cool.
So hopefully everyone is drinking coffee this morning. I know I am, but I think that may be the reality for a lot of our families out in Illinois as they were dealing with remote learning. I have warned my 5-year-old not to come into here, but if you see that door open, that he may also be joining us. So obviously a lot of challenges, and not to minimize, the real challenges of broadband access and devices and those things of that nature, and working parents that have continued to work outside of the home throughout this whole process. But I thought that was just kind of a funny video and just kind of maybe hopefully lighten the mood. So it's not all exactly just everyone sitting at the table all together, just doing their work. So the requirements in the legislation for remote and blended learning, just kind of as a caveat. So all of these provisions are subject to whether or not there's a declared disaster to a public health emergency. So that language is actually in the bill. For every section that this applies to, this is the sort of the caveat before it. So my understanding or my interpretation would be that until we were completely out of all of this, and perhaps maybe in phase 5, or maybe not even until we're out of phase 5, whatever that looks like, we would be technically still in a disaster declaration. So these items would apply, if we are perhaps in phase 4 come fall. So the items that need to be within those remote and blended learning plans are pretty, I'd say pretty similar to what's in the e-learning plans. So if you're already familiar with those, or if your district has already developed one of those, perhaps you have some familiarity with this, but it's really just, there's not a lot of direction necessarily, like you have to have this, this, and this, but it really just needs to make sure that you're providing equitable access to all of your students, that the learning day reflects state standards if applicable, that you've got a means for a student to confer with an educator. I know I've just heard tons of, that was in the video, Zoom meetings, Google Meets, Google Hangouts, you name it. People have been trying to find ways for kids to still connect with their teachers if they need to. And really trying to find a way to address the unique needs of kids in special populations, so special ed students, English learners, students that are homeless or vulnerable in another way, how the district is going to take attendance and monitor participation through all of this. I know that's probably been something a lot of districts have been struggling with, and not just monitoring, but how do we make sure that we are doing something that kids, want to do. I think the do no harm and that sort of grading and attendance and that sort of thing will probably change. And I'm sure those are conversations that are happening in your districts come fall, if we are back into a blended or a remote situation. And then of course, how to transition from remote learning to on-site learning upon the declaration that the disaster is no longer there. So I would imagine if as tech educators, as digital educators, or as educators, period, that you are having, or hopefully you're engaged in some of those conversations. And I know administrators, I know building level administrators and district administrators are trying to figure that out themselves as well. So hopefully you're engaged with that process too. Just a couple more things on the plan requirements. So each plan has to be posted on the district website just for transparency purposes, and then allowing for curricular mandates to be administered via those district or blended plans, except behind the wheel instruction, which I think is probably smart. Of course, I understand blended behind the wheel is back in action again. In fact, I was driving downtown Springfield just the other day and saw folks pulling into Springfield High School and cars pulling out with student drivers and everyone wearing masks. So that is definitely back up and running again. And really, I think the thing that we were maybe looking for was a bit more curricular mandate flexibility, just given these circumstances. There really is not much curricular flexibility, or if any, really, in the bill. Fitness assessments are not required during remote learning, but beyond that, pretty much everything else is. And I'll talk about just the graduation requirements and the Constitution test in just a moment. There we go. So I think, as everyone probably recalls, there were some executive orders on graduation requirements and other things that students, other modifications for students that were seniors in high school this year, so they could still wrap up their school year and not get left behind somehow. So the Constitution and the U.S. History exam is still required. It could be administered remotely. I don't have the expertise or the knowledge of what platforms are available, or if there are remote exams out there that would satisfy this, but I'm sure there are. Any diplomas that are issued under modified graduation requirements are valid, just to make sure that kids could then, matriculate to higher education or wherever they're going to end up after high school, that those diplomas are valid for their purpose. And then allowing grades of pass, credit, or satisfactory to fulfill some prerequisite requirements in higher ed as well. So sometimes, you have to have had foreign language, or so many years, obviously so many years of math and English. So those grades, if there weren't letter grades, those would satisfy those purposes for those students. And again, my super boring slides, I'm sorry guys, but this is not, PowerPoints are not always my forte. But of course, there's a picture of what graduations used to look like before we drove diplomas around to everyone. So also in there is some licensure extensions. So I think that's probably like the most reason why, or the biggest reason that people are really anxious for this bill to get signed into law, because we are quickly approaching July 1. So all licenses issued by ISB that expire at the end of this month that have not been renewed by the 2020 renewal period would be extended for another year. And I threw in some of the PD requirements that are still applicable, even if there is an or even with the extension on licenses. And this information is from the wonderful Sue Holmes from our office, who has been in constant communication with ISB on trying to figure out what are our PD requirements, what are folks going to still be responsible for. So really, professional development, there's an extension to complete your required PD hours. If you have to take administrator academies, there's another year extension for those. But then in the following, oh, I forgot a number. I believe that's June 30, 2021. So really, if you are not caught up on your administrator academies, you'd have to do anything that you owe in addition to another one for next year. So really, you're probably looking at 2 for next year. And then renewing your license, of course, involves meeting those requirements and the $50 registration fee. Teacher evaluations. So evaluations that were not fully complete when school closed, and not just like, oh, we just needed to have one more meeting. If they were still really in process of having formal evaluations, informal, all those meetings. If that information, if that documentation was not complete when schools closed in March, this provides for a default evaluation of proficient, except for those individuals who had an excellent the year before. It would then default to an excellent for this year as well. So really, putting the pause button on any evaluations right now, and going forward, pretty much everyone sticks with what they had before, or they default to proficient if it was still in process. But I think just from talking to a lot of our members, I think a lot of administrators had theirs wrapped up by the end of February, early March. So hopefully that's not too much of an issue. And of course, the state budget. So, I think going into this, I think most of us were kind of feeling like, looking around, reading the room, especially with the economic conditions created by the virus and just, build economic shutdowns, really. I think we were going to be happy to see a flat budget and be thankful for that. And that's really what we're ending up with. So it's a flat budget with $1 million additional just to help make sure that the distribution is true to the evidence-based model. So just in case there's a bit of a cushion, if you will, to kind of make sure that everything gets distributed the way it was last year. There's nothing really, no one loses anything. Nearly all the mandated categoricals and other line items are also flat at last year's levels. The budget did allocate, and so we're sort of serving as a pass-through almost, the state is, for the CARES money. So it did allocate that money in the CARES funding to ISB to then distribute to districts based on their Title I eligibility, and then an additional $108.5 million also from federal funds that the governors received as an emergency education relief fund. So the governors received this money and they could split it between K through 12 and higher ed as they chose. K through 12 got the largest chunk of that money here in Illinois, which is great. So that will be, I'm not sure how that will be distributed quite yet from the state board's perspective. Of course, the thing to remind you of is that the budget is really predicated on a lot of borrowing, and a lot of borrowing from the federal government that I think the thought would be forgiven at some point, or in a new CARES package. I think we're on like CARES 4 or 5 maybe. Maybe that would be something that would cover that gap that states would not have to necessarily worry about. But there's a lot of political wrangling over whether or not that is the appropriate thing to do and base our budget like that. But nonetheless, here we are. So the CARES funding, again, I hope this is not too repetitive for anyone, and hopefully you've all seen documents from the state board about what you can spend that money on. I think maybe especially for this group, obviously providing technology for online learning, including classroom or online learning support in the summer and after school programs, professional development, those types of things to really handle the impact of the virus and the impact of school closures and remote learning is what the money is intended for. So I'm not super expert in this topic, so if there are questions, I'd be happy to try to find some answers from someone else, but just want to kind of just remind everyone what that money is intended for and what the allowable uses are. And then one thing I thought that this group might be interested in, so Public Act 101-640 it expands the reach of, or expands maybe the charge, I should say, of the Broadband Advisory Council. So it directs the Advisory Council to study both providing free broadband access to all Illinois residents and also alternatively providing affordable access. So I think just trying to be realistic about what the possibilities are for providing free access to everyone throughout the state. And they have a pretty quick timeline. So they are supposed to issue their report no later than January 1 of 2021. So be on the lookout for that. I'm not as familiar with the council's makeup. I was trying to look through the statute last night, and it looks like there's some folks maybe from the higher ed that's been appointed to that committee. But perhaps there are others from the K-12 areas that I'm not aware of that are also part of that council. But if you're interested in that, I can try to find some more information on that as well. And then just one more thing I thought was interesting. There were a few other bills related to schools, especially in terms of Open Meetings Act and things that maybe school boards are a little bit more sensitive to, and things that would impact their operations. But I thought this one was particularly important too. So of course, vote by mail just for this coming fall election would be expanded, and election day would be a state holiday as well. So schools could close. Schools, however, would be made available as a polling place. And I think, as we've seen, at least for my polling place, even here in Springfield, it's down the street, but it's a senior living home. So I think just trying to, I'm thinking probably a lot of your areas as well, you've got nursing homes, senior living facilities, those types, senior centers, those types of facilities that are generally used as polling places. And by the time the fall rolls around, we may not want to have a lot of foot traffic in and out of those places, just, wondering and making sure that those vulnerable folks are not exposed to a lot of people. So it would make schools available as polling places, but students and staff would not have to be there. I've told our members that likely the principal is probably going to have to be there just to, let everything in and let everyone in and make sure everything's going smoothly. So it won't be like no one has to show up that day, but probably just a few people. And then it also allows folks that are 16 years or older to serve as election judges. So again, kind of expanding those folks that maybe not as vulnerable to infection to kind of help man the polls instead of some folks that might have done it otherwise.
Hey, Allison, there was a question on the last slide. Is the Broadband Advisory Council also looking at broadband speed? You may have internet, but it's not fast enough for an effective video conference. And then I think just as I interrupted you, Amber replied, yes, Broadband Advisory Council is looking at speeds as well. Priority 1, access across the state, but with understanding speeds impact use. Do you have any more on that, or?
I don't. I will defer to Amber for her expertise there.
Perfect.
Yeah. And I'm seeing there's another question about polling places. Schools that are not polling places be open. I think schools would not be open in terms of having students there, students and staff. So, but I think they would be made available for local election authorities to use instead of perhaps maybe senior centers, assisted living, those types of places. So I know the School Board Association has been pretty active on that topic, just making sure that the local school district or the local school board has the autonomy to say yes or no. But I think the thought is that as long as students aren't there and staff aren't there, that maybe it's a bit more secure to have that as a polling place instead of some of those other places in your towns or communities that might have served as one before.
Okay, and then I'm assuming the next question is again about the broadband. Will it be added to rural areas, say that 10 times fast, that still do not have availability?
Yeah, I'm just gonna let Amber handle these.
There you go, there she answered.
Yeah, like I said, I am not super familiar with the council. And really what's in the legislation, what's in that bill is almost exactly what I have on that slide. They're gonna study the practicality for having free internet or free broadband and the practicality for having affordable. So how that fleshes out within the council, all the things that are being asked about, I think that is all probably on the table. But that's really just the simplest language as to what was in the bill. All right, if we're good, I'll keep rolling here. So, okay, it's for everyone else. Got it. So just to kind of shift gears a little bit and to, you know, our engagement and our advocacy. And so just, you know, just to be clear, so I am really speaking from my role at the IPA, but I try to make these slides and make this information applicable to anyone really, and especially educators, and how you can be more engaged and advocate for your schools, advocate for the profession, advocate for your kids, obviously. So if there are questions about, you know, what we do or what you might be interested in participating in, please let me know. So really just the basics. You know, it really comes down to, do you know your legislators? And so if not, I think we're going to be sharing these slides afterwards. And so I've got a link right here that you can click on. It goes to the State Board of Elections webpage. So you can put in your home address and your school address. And I really think that that's important to have both sort of in your back pocket, just so that you know, if you live in a district that's different from, or legislative district rather, that is different from where you work, I think that makes a difference. And I think, you know, that just gives you more people to build relationships with. And so you are a constituent of someone, regardless of who it is, but you are also perhaps a constituent of someone else that represents your school, your community, where your students are coming from, and represents that local school district as well. So I think that's important to kind of know both if you don't live in an area where the same representatives or the same senators cover both spots. And then really just reach out. You know, sometimes a simple email, just an introduction, or maybe reaching out through a phone call. As far as I know, most district offices are back open again, and I'm sure people are checking email regardless. So I think maybe just to reach out and just say, hey, I'm a teacher, or I'm a staff member in this school district, just wanted to say hello. If there's anything I can do for you, or any information I can provide about my students and my district or what we're working on, please just let me know. And then that's how you can build that relationship. You know, I tell a lot of our members that they should be looking to be the trusted source of information especially for education policy with their local legislators. You know, we kind of joke that all legislators went to school, which doesn't make them necessarily an expert on education, or even if they are parents, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are have a lot of expertise in the field and policy areas. And really, it's probably just limited to those experiences that they have personally. So I think it's important for all of you and for administrators and teachers to really reach out and just kind of give them, not give them the what for, but just kind of give them the expertise that you have about what really happens in schools, and the cool things that you guys are doing, and the opportunities for students. And really, you know, a lot of legislators, I just heard this the other day. I spoke to Representative Will Davis, who's up north in the suburbs and south suburban area. And, you know, he was just pretty frank with me. And he said, you know, when you come to the table as a representative of the Alliance or of the Principals Association, you know, a lot of times we just see one person. And for us as legislators, we want to know what the impact is of whatever legislation you're speaking on our districts. So I think that's really important to be able to have somebody they can contact back home that can give them that perspective, and it just, you know, have that open line of communication. We had a former legislative chair, former president of our association, Kim Lisenby Barber, who was from the Spring Valley area. She was very close and had a very good relationship with Frank Martino, who was a majority leader in the House. And so to the point where he would call her on the floor and say, well, where's the Alliance on this? Where's the school? Where's IPA on this? If it hadn't been in a committee, if the bill hadn't been in a committee that he sat on, what was going on, he would reach out to her, really just pick up the phone and give her a call on her cell phone. So those kind of relationships are really, really helpful. So here's a slide on how a bill becomes a law. This is what we probably all learned in school. So you've got the bill introduced, you've got the committee hearing in the first chamber, If it passes out of committee, it goes to the floor in the first chamber, and then there's a committee hearing in the second chamber, gets a floor vote there, and then it goes to the governor's office. Pretty simple. This is really what happens. So it's a bit of a mess. So you might have a bill introduced, whether it's in the House or the Senate. And so from there, you know, sometimes I don't want to spoil it for you, but a lot of time legislators don't reach out to educators or don't reach out to stakeholders right away before they introduce legislation. So then we have to go and talk to them kind of after the fact and say, well, great idea, but this is how it would play out in practice. And, you know, we have some changes, we have some suggestions. Sometimes they take them, sometimes they don't. So in my scenario here, they did not. So it goes to committee. And even though we've tried to reach out and say, you know, we have some issues, we may have to go to the table and testify to those issues. And so sometimes if they're reading the room and there just aren't enough votes to get it out of committee, the bill gets held in committee. And so, you know, we reach out again and try to see if we can get some changes. So there's no vote in the committee. Then we offer some amendments and things that, you know, sometimes they get accepted, sometimes they don't, and then it goes back to committee again, they vote on it again, and it gets out this time. Then it goes to the floor vote, so same deal, floor vote in the first chamber. So then it moves on to the second chamber, right? Again, another committee hearing, another chance, another bite at the apple sometimes for us as lobbyists. If we still have some opposition, it's just another opportunity to see if we can get some amendments put on the bill to kind of alleviate some of our concerns. So a lot of times that this has happened more frequently in the last 4 or 5 years or so. If there is still opposition to a bill, but you know, the legislator knows they've got the votes to get it out and move forward with it, you'll hear, I commit to working on this and I will bring it back to committee and make sure that all those concerns are addressed. So they kind of, the other members kind of give them a little bit of deference sometimes and let them get a bill out, let them work on it, put it, you know, hold it on second reading, and hopefully it'll come back again with some of the changes that we might be looking for. So we've got it for our First Amendment. Maybe that satisfies everything and maybe there's no problems there. And then we find a typo. So there's a Second Amendment and then there was a comma in the wrong place and then there was a may instead of a shall or a shall instead of a may. So we've got to make some more changes. So there's a Third Amendment. And then from there, we've got the last vote in the committee on the second chamber before it goes to the floor. And it passes out of there, goes to the floor in the second chamber, and finally gets to the governor's office and it gets signed into law. So bit of a mess sometimes, and there's all kinds of other things that can kind of throw this whole squiggly line off as well. Sometimes your bill gets shelled, which is really just a way of saying it gets erased and then it's used for another purpose, another topic. So even though you might have had something that you thought was agreed to, that bill gets used as what we call a vehicle bill. So it's a vehicle for something else to happen with that. So it just kind of depends. Do you want to take a minute to, let's see, do we have any other questions there?
Yeah, there was one a little bit back, wondering if there are any plans in place for a fall legislative session.
Yes, so there's a scheduled veto session for November. They're not scheduled to come back. I'm trying to think. I want to say it's November 17th, probably the week before Thanksgiving, and I think usually the week after Thanksgiving. So a little bit later this year. There have been, I'm sure as you're all watching the news and understanding what's going on in the world, there have been several members of the Black Caucus in Illinois that have requested or been talking about a special session to deal with some issues of racial equity and inclusion, those types of things, criminal justice reform. I have not heard that there's anything scheduled just yet. So we will kind of keep an eye out for that as well. And I don't know when that would be. Not even sure if it would be under those same circumstances where we had the House in a different facility than the Senate and what that would even look like. So there has been talk about having perhaps a special session kind of geared for those subjects, but I have not heard anything definitive just yet. But they definitely always come back in the fall for the veto session. And while it is called the veto session, there are some times where new bills are introduced and the whole process still takes place. So it's still an opportunity for more legislation to pass come veto session.
Okay. And then somebody also asked, so many bills out there, is there an easy way to find bills that just affect education?
Yes and no. So if you are a member of an association that is tracking legislation, I think that's probably the best way. You know, I put out weekly newsletters for our members at IPA. I know ISA does the same. I would venture to guess that IEA and IFT are doing something similar with their members. So, or if you are a member of an education association that has a presence at the Capitol, that's a really good way of keeping track of things. Otherwise, I will say it is a bit difficult if you don't have special tools, and there are all kinds of vendors that help us track legislation and see when things have been amended or filed or introduced or scheduled for committee hearings. You can go to ilga.gov, and my suggestion would be to click on both in the House and the Senate. They each have education committees. So you can see what's on their docket, if you will, during session, and see what bills are being considered for each of those committees. We track as the Alliance, as the School Management Alliance with ISA and IASBO and ISB, we track a lot of bills. I mean, I really kind of focus on the bills that are before those substantive committees that really have to do with, you know, curricular mandates or sometimes student discipline, things like that. But of course, the school board as the employer is also tracking legislation related to, you know, health insurance, Open Meetings Act, FOIA, all those things that a local government would have to track just so that they know and can be prepared for any changes that they might have to make. So I would say for not knowing who all is in the audience today, but I would say if you are a teacher or an administrator, I would say to start with those education committees in the House and the Senate, just to kind of see what they're working on. And see if there's anything that jumps out at you, and certainly you know, you can reach out to me or others that are tracking that kind of legislation on a more regular basis during session. If you have questions about what it means, what it does, you know, that would be fine too.
Great. And then I don't know if you'd be prepared to talk about this one right now, but someone said specifically interested in IPA's take on HB 5114.
I am going to write it down, and I'm going to have to look it up. I don't know it off the top of my head. As you can see, there are thousands of bills that get filed every year. So we are in the 5,000s at least in the House, probably if not more. But computer science, I will check on that. Not knowing what the language looks like, but I will check on that and maybe get back with you before the end, or I can email you separately. So sure thing. All right, so how can you make an impact? Even if you don't know what legislation is floating around right now or in the fall or next spring, not a big deal. I think what I wanted to convey today was that you can still make an impact regardless, even if you're not maybe taking a position on a particular bill or filing a witness slip or coming to testify or anything like that. So just a few things that I have always recommended to our members. So school visits, I think, are great. We have a program called Principal for a Day. So I invite legislators to go and be principal for a day in a school in their district. And I think that really gives them an opportunity to just, number one, build that relationship with that administrator. And number two, you know, see what's really going on. And if that's a building that maybe their kids don't go to, or maybe they went to at some point in their life, they can really see from the inside what's really happening. And just even for our purpose, the workload that principals have, and not that anyone else doesn't have a huge workload, but just, I think that gives them an appreciation of what everyone is up to in the school day. So I think you know, invite them to your visit or your school or your classroom, you know, not knowing the politics or anything or procedures for what that looks like in your district or in your building. I don't know if you need approval for that, but just kind of tuck that away as an idea. You know, sharing student projects with your local legislators, whether it's a quick email or you know, just I probably email is probably the best way to do it, is to kind of just share what your students are up to. And then if your district has maybe a public relations staff, to maybe share that information with legislators as well. That'd be a really good way to start reaching out. At IPA, we have a legislative committee. So it's really open to any of our members to take part in, to participate in. We only meet once a year in person, which is usually at our fall conference, which I think is going to be a early spring conference this year. And really, this is our first line of action when it comes to legislative priorities and legislative action. So I usually reach out to them if there are openings on task forces, anything along those lines, and I usually reach out to them too, just to kind of get some feedback on some legislative proposals, just to kind of see, I might have a first impression of what this means for a school district or what it means for a building, but they can kind of give me a little bit more detail on what that means for them, or whether or not it's a big deal even that we need to even worry about. And then, of course, action alerts. So we have 2 national associations that we work with the National Association of Elementary School Principals and with secondary school principals. So that I really rely on them for a lot of the federal action alerts of things that are going on Capitol Hill. But we also have a system called Phone to Action, where we have set up action alerts for our members to just quickly, it's a canned message that you can usually edit, but it just sends off an email to your local legislators just with your opinions, your position on certain legislation. You don't have to really do much with it. It just kind of just sends it and goes. So you plug in your address and it takes it off from there. So I would suggest if you are receiving those action alerts from your associations, from other organizations you belong to really take the time to participate in those. I think sometimes, having worked in a couple legislative offices, it just kind of depends, quantity over quality. But I think, if you have a quality message and it really resonates and it has something that's really specific that a legislator can latch onto, I think that's wonderful. And then a lot of times just having the quantity of messages coming in really sends a message to that legislator that this is something they should pay attention to. I was working for Representative Bob Fleiter in Decatur when Tier 2 pensions were coming around, and I can just remember, just stacks and stacks and stacks of postcards that came in from teachers and administrators that we had to log and see if they were from the district or not, and those types of things. So that the quantity really makes a difference too. So, now that we're living in this new time, we're not in the before times, we're in the now times, I guess. I think something to think about, and something that we are thinking about at IPA, is how to remotely advocate. We hosted 3 town hall meetings with some legislators, a couple of months ago, back in April, on Zoom. So I think that's a really good way to kind of reach out and maybe share some thoughts, share some concerns, share some information at least with legislators. So if you can get them to commit to maybe sitting in on a town hall meeting or some kind of a legislative meeting with you or with a group of your colleagues, maybe from your region. I think you guys are broken up into different regions like we are, in Abe Lincoln and Corn Belt and whole bit. So if maybe there's a way to kind of schedule something with your local legislators to share some thoughts, or at least maybe hear from them even about what things that they're thinking about that they want feedback on. And then I think too, classroom visits. While we're not sure what the fall is going to look like, or even the spring, and it may be kind of limited to who is available or who is allowed to come into school buildings, maybe this is another way to really have them come in as a guest speaker, via Zoom or Google Meet or what have you, to talk to your students. And it's great for social studies classes, but I think just any kind of classroom that you have that you want to show something off or share that information with the legislator, I think that's a really good opportunity to do so. And so I think a lot of people are thinking outside the box now of how do we connect with other people? And I think the same is true of connecting with legislators. So just a couple of current advocacy efforts that I think maybe some of you guys are already aware of, or something that I know we've been pushing out to our members. So like I mentioned, we've got NAESP that has a action alert right now on more funding for schools. And these are, when the slides go out, you can click on these pictures and it will take you to the action alert. So NAESP's is on funding for schools, and of course the future ready schools, which I think IDEA is a part of. Has had a lot of good advocacy around the E-rate expansion and allowing more allowable uses for that money. So if you haven't participated in those, or you haven't sent a tweet out yet, I would encourage you to do that as well. And really, that's what I've got for today. So happy to take some more questions and thoughts, anything you'd like to share. looks like you guys have a Capitol Day. Yeah.
Yeah, we have, it used to be called Tech and then whatever the year was. And this year we had renamed it with our own rebranding. And it was going to be the Amplify Innovation Student Showcase.
Okay.
And unfortunately that got canceled, but we are actually in its place. We still wanted our students to be able to tell their stories of tech innovations, both in and out of the classroom. So we have 20 student authors right now who are authoring a chapter each of a book that we'll be publishing later this summer, telling their stories.
Very cool.
And then our desire is to get that in front of the legislators again, so that they still hear, you know, what is going on. And there's there's some stories about the students, their feelings, how they thought the remote learning went. They're not all remote learning, but there's some within the book. So that will be cool to see.
Nice, yeah. Yeah, those kinds of activities I think I was going to mention coming to the Capitol, but I don't know what that's going to look like next year. I don't know what that looks like for lobbyists yet. So we've never really had an IPA specific Capitol Day. I know we've participated in the Alliance legislative summits where we've had superintendents, board members, business officials all go together on one day. But yeah, not sure how that's going to play out this year.
Good. Okay, so questions. Do you know if IDEA, the special education, not us, the special ed one, funding, can be used to provide laptops for students even if they do not originally qualify for assistive technology?
I don't. And I guess, Jenna, if there's a way to save the chat, I can maybe try to find some of those questions out.
And I will, and I'll actually be including the chat with all the information that gets emailed out.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it not to give a good answer there.
Okay, another question. Are legislators thinking of canceling specials, PE, art, STEM, music, etc., like California and Massachusetts?
I don't know that legislators are thinking that. I think, you know, we are still kind of waiting to see what ISB and DPH comes out with for phase 4 guidance, or whatever that may be, the next set of guidance, we'll say. I think what we have been sharing with school administrators, and we've actually gotten a group together of superintendents and business officials and principals to kind of, here are the critical questions that you as a district need to answer based on whatever the public health guidance is. So if the public health guidance for like summer school, I think was, I had to chuckle a little bit. I was a band kid. So having band practice, but only removing your mask unless absolutely necessary. I mean, as a trumpet player, I don't know what you do there. I guess the drum line can rehearse, but no one else. So I think it just depends. I think it depends on what the guidance will be for public health restrictions and social distancing and masking and all of those things. I think those are probably going to be more at the district level as to whether or not they have the capacity to comply with those restrictions, and whether or not that makes sense for those kids and for those districts. I think, you know, IHSA has come out with some recommendations, perhaps is maybe not the right word, but I think they will be coming out with more, I'm sure, just based on how things are changing with public health recommendations. And so if you can compete and you can have tackle football, you know, I don't know what that means for other kinds of specials and in terms of PE and art as well. But I think sharing materials is a big concern. Having kids maybe still stay social distanced is a concern. My son is going into kindergarten, and what recess looks like, and can a 5-year-old keep a mask on all day? I don't know. I mean, those are all things that are on my mind as well as a parent. But I know are things that people are thinking about with their districts and what their plans might be. So to answer the question in a roundabout way, I don't think legislators are thinking of canceling that. I think it's really going to be more of a local district decision based on their capacity.
Gotcha. And Steve, there are no silly questions. Are Illinois districts mandated to follow CDC guidelines to the letter?
Oh boy.
I don't even think it's possible.
Yeah, as not the attorney, I'm speaking not as the attorney. I don't know that it's possible. I think you're right. I think that's another thing that we're telling, and we're sharing with superintendents and principals, is that you need to consult with maybe your local public health department, your insurance carrier, and what your legal counsel is telling you, especially in terms of liability. I know, especially for transportation, let's say. So a lot of the bus service companies are saying, like, we can't do anything beyond the CDC guidelines, or we're going to be on the hook. So if the CDC says you can only have 10 people in a vehicle, no matter how big it is, that's all we're going to do. So I think, you're going to be up against what your vendors have the ability to do sometimes, especially in terms of transportation. And what your legal counsel and what your insurance carriers are telling you as a district.
That's good advice. Is there any idea when further guidance might come out about the fall?
I don't know. I've heard rumors all week that we might see something tomorrow. So keep an eye out. I don't know what it looks like. I have not been a part of those conversations. I know we've had 2 principals that have been part of that group. It's a large stakeholder group of, I think, 55 people or so. But I have heard possibly tomorrow or maybe by the end of the week. And I don't know how far that stretches either. I don't know if that's like, here's everything for phase 4. I don't know. It could just be piece by piece. Here's what you might be thinking about for the fall. I'm not sure. What I will say is I know that Department of Public Health has staff embedded at ISB that's helping with all this process. So there is a lot of, from what I can tell, good communication there. But hopefully by the end of the week, maybe we might have a little bit more details.
Good. Okay. If you want to go, I think we're good on question. Oh, will that message come from Governor or ISB, or did you just say that?
I think any further guidance will probably come from ISB. Again, I don't have a crystal ball into the governor's staff, but I don't know I know some governors in some states have said, well, this is what our state is doing. I think just from kind of reading the tea leaves and reading Governor Pritzker's, maybe, I don't know, I don't want to read too much into his thoughts, but I think the idea is that we will begin school like we will on the timeline that we normally would. Now, it may not look exactly the same. So I think we will begin school, but it may look different depending on where you're at and depending on what phase we're in, that kind of thing. So it's all just kind of up in the air as far as I know.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I just put the PDH link into the chat. And Allison, if you can flip to that next slide.
Oh, I've got one slide on IPA, so join us if you're interested.
And so next week, we do have another Wednesday webinar. We hope you'll join us. It's Computer Science